Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Rosenkranz. Welcome to my course on metaphysics. Let me start out by giving you a syllabus. I printed this off of our course website. As you may be aware, this course is cross-listed with an online section of metaphysics, which is fairly comparably enrolled. I think it actually has 15 students in it. This has 14 right now, but those numbers may bump around before they finally settle down. So actually, I believe all of you initially registered for section 2 of this. I've combined the two sections so you can be on the same discussion boards as the online students and interact. When you enter into the Canvas shell, it would be for 01 that you would be going. Maybe the 02 one's been taken off your Canvas site. I don't know what the system does, but when I cross-listed them, they were combined. I take it some people have already, some of you have already been into the web page for the course. So however you got in there, you should be going into the 01. It's sort of a lavendery purplish color. There was originally an 02 one there also that was separate, but I may have vanished now. I combined them. Have a seat. This is metaphysics. Anybody have two by any chance?
Oh, yeah, one.
Great. Okay, so take a moment and look through this and let me know if you have any questions. Basically, I'll go through the highlights of it. Basically, there are two required books. One is the Historical Dictionary of Metaphysics, Rosenkranz and Hoffman, and Substance, Its Nature and Existence, Hoffman and Rosenkranz. Very similar authorship. In addition to this, there are some required readings from other sources. They're all on the website under files. And that'll be indicated in the syllabus when there's a reading in file. Some of those are readings from other books that I've put in there. Those books are also on reserve at the library. So if you go to the reserve desk, there are 3 books, and you can take any one of them out for 24 hours, or you can read them in the library for as long as the library is open. Those 3 are Wiley Blackwell Companion to Metaphysics, okay. Edited by Jaegwon Kim, Ernest Souza, and me. And then there's another one, the Oxford Handbook of Metaphysics. And there's a third one, another book on the concept of haixeity, which is a supplementary, but there are some readings required in that, in the unit on individuation. Let me get to that. All right, so those are also replicated, though, on the website in Canvas. There are files of all the required readings. But there may be many supplementary readings in those other books that you might want to look at for a paper project, or for your own edification, or for deeper knowledge, or whatever, readings on a wide variety of major topics in metaphysics, in those various handbooks and companions. There are going to be, this is a writing intensive course, so there are going to be a fair number of writing assignments there aren't any tests other than writing assignment types of tests. So there are 3 essay exams and 2 relatively short papers. One of those papers you will have an opportunity to rewrite. So you'll do a first draft, get some feedback, and then rewrite it, and your grade will be based on the final rewrite. I'm happy to discuss paper topics and even look at outlines even before the first paper is due. So feel free to inquire about that. So each of the 2 papers, which are supposed to be between 7 to 10 pages in length, something like that, are worth 20% of the grade. Each of the 3 essay exams, and that includes the final exam, which is the third of the 3 exams, are worth 15%. And then there are discussion boards. So for each topic, there's a discussion board in Canvas, and you're asked to make an initial response and then 2 replies to one person or another, for a minimum of 27 posts in the course overall. If you do that, and you're like at least minimally lucid and coherent, you'll get the full 15 points for that. So when you add all that up, it ends up to Any questions about the grading system? Okay, so I've organized the course by topics. Some topics last for a week, some for 2 weeks, some for a week and a half, whatever. So we start out with what is metaphysics? That's our first topic, and that's like a 2-week long thing. And then we go to modalities. That has to do with different kinds of beings, like necessary, contingent, possible, and impossible beings. And then the next unit's on universals and particulars. And then there's one on identity. And you can see in there when the papers are due. So when it says second paper due, that's the initial. So those are both. You can choose which one of those you want to do as your rewrite. Mm-hmm. You can either make it your first paper or your second paper. Obviously, if you do the first paper, you have more time. Then comes individuation, topic 6. Space and time is topic 7. Causation, topic 8. And substance, topic 9. And topic 10, I guess I got a topic 10 too, parts and wholes. Okay, and since we don't have an in-class final, I've scheduled a 3-hour class on that last day. So that's what that is, on May 5th instead of a final. That's what technically you're supposed to do, or at least at one point in time, that's what the university said I was supposed to do. I haven't checked on whether that's still something we're supposed to do or not. But it seems like if students have to sit for a 3-hour exam and you don't, we might as well come in and finish up what we started with parts and wholes. So, yeah. So I may have made a mistake here in that I now have 10 units. And when I started out, I had 9. Let me check and make sure that it's actually 10. Let's see, and I haven't jumped a number. But let's see, 1, 2. Yeah, there's no number 3. So there's a misnumbering. Okay, so I just have to renumber that. So it'll still be 27 posts as opposed to 30 posts, which is what I'd have to change it to if I had 10. We don't have 10, we actually just have a typo, which is what I thought. So, yeah. So this should just be 9 topics. So I'll renumber it. You can do that on your own copy if you want to, but online it'll be fixed. See it on there. All right. So I think I've covered the basics here. I say if you have any questions, would be a good time to raise
On
them.
categories of ontology, do you think tropes exist? I asked you that before and you didn't answer.
Oh, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I have to go in the logical order of things.
I'll never get an answer.
Yeah, well, stay tuned, yeah, right. See, so, yeah, by questions, I meant questions about the syllabus or like the course procedure, not about why is there something rather than nothing or whatever.
It's the meaning of life.
Yeah. How did life start? Okay, so let's start out at the beginning. Metaphysics actually comes from the ta meta, ta physica. This was the title given to a body of writing authored by Aristotle, which has come down to us as Aristotle's Metaphysics, the work, the Metaphysics. Ta in Greek, if anyone doesn't know, means the. So what would the translation of this? It would be the meta, the physica. Oh, what the heck does that mean? Well, meta in ancient Greek meant after. So what this really says is the after the physics. By physics, the ancient Greeks, or Aristotle at least, meant the study of change in nature, of processes, natural processes and changes in the world. So it's very close, very similar to what we mean by physics today. Maybe very similar. Right? And maybe a little broader. Might have included chemical changes as well. Just dynamical changes. So what this is saying is it's what comes after the physics. So the guy who edited Aristotle's works at the time that the name was given was a character named Andronicus of Rhodes. You know, like where they had the Colossus of Rhodes. Andronicus of that place, of Rhodes. He was a commentator and editor. He was putting together at the time in the ancient world the definitive collection or edition of Aristotle's works. And he didn't know what to call this. It was an untitled section by Aristotle. He hadn't given it any name. So we just called it, you know, the stuff that comes after the physics and the pile of papers that we have. So we have the Aristotle's writings on physics, then we have this other stuff, which is the after the physics, and therefore it came to be known as metaphysics. So metaphysics title is highly accidental and contingent, which is an ironic thing since metaphysics purports to deal with the fundamental essence of science. Right? So the Greeks had an ironic sense of humor, as you may know from other classes you've had. So in Latin, though, which took over a lot of Greek, meta had a broader or different meaning. It also carried the connotation, which it does in English as well, because English was influenced very much by Latin. The connotation of that which is beyond or transcends. So like a meta-language. Anyone know what that is? A meta-language is a language that you create to talk about another language. Okay. So you can say things in the meta-language maybe that you can't say in the original language, which is known as the object language. So this is a thing in semantics. So that gives you the idea of something which goes beyond the original. So it's not saying it's a language that comes after the, right? But it has a different meaning, the meaning of beyond or transcending. So we may often think of that when we think of metaphysics, that it's something that, transcends or goes beyond physics. That leads to the notion that metaphysics is a study of supernatural things. And if you go to the bookstore and look in the metaphysics section with a sign, you're going to find a lot of stuff like that there. You might find some philosophy books, but you might also find some books on like other spiritual dimensions and on life after death and channeling and all kinds of things. Right? And the fact is, metaphysics, since the Middle Ages, that word metaphysics has carried those connotations too, but they're popularizations. They're not actually what philosophical metaphysics is. We can't understand metaphysics as a study of the supernatural. Though it may study supernatural beings, it's certainly not limited to the study or particularly focused on the study of supernatural beings. So what is metaphysics then? What is the correct definition, distinguishing it from a purely contingent description, like it was the stuff that came after the physics in Aristotle's pile? Who knows what that is, right? Could be about poetry or literature, it could be anything, right? And also distinguishing it from the somewhat inaccurate, though not completely false idea that metaphysics might study supernatural beings, like spirits and angels, things like that, which it can study. So the correct definition, I think, is, or at least my best shot at a definition, is that metaphysics is the study of the basic structure of reality. Like any discipline, it branches out and can get fuzzy on the edges, but that's the core of what it does. And some of the problems it deals with are closer to the center of that than others, but they all involve basic structural questions about what kinds of beings exist in the universe, how those beings are interrelated to one another. And dealing with any tensions that may arise within different aspects of the universe with respect to different kinds of beings that might exist in the world. Okay, so was there a comment?
I put it down because you sort of talked about exactly what I was going to ask about, because it was,
yeah, go ahead.
If it's the basic structure of reality, I have a hard time seeing how, like, studying things like, unicorns or leprechauns, things that aren't a part of reality, sort of by definition, or like Darth Vader, it seems to fall outside the domain of that definition, yet it seems distinctly of the domain metaphysics.
Okay, so that's a great question. I'm so glad that you raised it. I'm glad that I asked you to raise it. So, what about the idea that there's some realm of, say, unreal things that metaphysics looks at? That was the import of it.
Okay.
Like unicorns. So how could that fit? First of all, is that true that metaphysics can look at those things? And secondly, how would that fit within the definition if we do accept that? So there's two parts to that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. All right, so does metaphysics in any sense look at those issues? Yes. Okay, so now we have to, all right. So now we have to look at how could that be consistent with this definition. Okay. Since the definition says it deals with the basic structure of reality, and these things, by hypothesis, seem unreal, like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and, the Grand Unicorn. Right. Yeah.
Doesn't that question also tie into meaningfulness of language itself as to whether the idea of a unicorn has any real meaning?
Well, sure, if we decide that a unicorn's a meaningless expression, then we could just dismiss his word.
Right.
But it seems to be a meaningful thing. We might even discover that unicorns exist, or something indistinguishable from a unicorn exists on another planet, right? I mean, we can't say definitively that they don't exist unless we define them as non-existing things, which we could do. We could say none of these other things, even though they're exactly like unicorns, could be unicorns because they're real, and the thing we're talking about is just a mythological thing, and so by definition, there won't be any unicorns. So then we'd be saying that they're impossible beings. Okay. And so it's still the question would remain, but the question would still remain, how is it that metaphysics can be said to have an interest in those kinds of things? I don't think it's going to fly to say, though, that it's a meaningless expression, because it seems to have plenty of meaning, and people have written books about them, and they're perfectly well understood. So I'm not sure how we would argue that it's meaningless.
I didn't argue that it's.
No, he didn't.
No,
You didn't. That was his
That's
suggestion.
my
Oh,
argument.
okay.
Yeah, he was saying, well, what if you say they're meaningless because you don't observe them? But there are lots of, another answer to that would be, well, there are lots of things we don't observe that we think are meaningful, like an individual photon or something. You can't observe it, but it's meaningful.
But we would still say that's a part of the structure of reality, but
Yeah.
when we say like Darth Vader or something like this, that seems very different than an electron. Or-
Well, it is, but those who advocate for the reality of those things are going to say that they're not actually non-existent, that they're real, right? And that we observe them in literature and stuff like that.
So it only fits in the branch of metaphysics if we believe that they're real in some, like in this.
Yeah. Yeah, so one might argue that since fictional things, one might argue that fictional things and mythological beings have a form of reality. So that's the only way they're going to come in. That's one way, I shouldn't say the only way. That's one way they can come into metaphysics, is via the move that they have a form of reality. That's not the only way. That's one option for getting them in, right? Is to say that they have a form of reality, that they are in fact created at a certain point in time, and that creation entails existence.
Yeah,
So you can say that,
doing metaphysics if they
who
don't
is
say
it?
that.
Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes. He's a literary creation. Therefore, he exists. He was created. He doesn't have the same kind of reality. He's not the same kind of being you are. He's a conceptual entity as opposed to a physical object. It might turn out the conceptual entities are physical too, though, that they're configurations of brain events. So they might all turn out to that. But those would be further metaphysical questions. Okay, that's one way, all right? There's another way, that some of these things could turn out to be parts of the study of metaphysics, which is that the basic structure of reality not only includes what actually exists, but also what potentially or possibly exists. Right? So that's part of reality too. So in other words,
What does reality mean then?
well, that's what metaphysics is. So for example, we can say there exist possibilities which are not realized. Which are unrealized.
I don't want to open up another
Well, just let me-
thing here, but saying they exist but they're not realized, what do you mean by exist? In what way do they exist?
Well, they exist, they're real possibilities, like the road not taken. So like you come to the crossroads, okay.
Oh.
All right, so this one leads to something very bad, and that one leads to something very good. And you have to decide, you don't know all that, you have very sketchy information, but you have to decide which fork in the road to take. One of these possibilities is going to be unrealized, but be sure if you had taken that road, you would have, it would have been realized. Yeah.
So in essence, it's just like what if, right?
In the case of possibilities, yeah. Yeah, but possibilities seem to be an important part of our calculations. And metaphysics is concerned with those modal categories, of which there are four: the possible, the necessary, the contingent, and the impossible. And so some philosophers have gone so far as to say that even impossible things have to be considered, even though they're not even possible. Simply by having a status of being impossible, they exist in an impossible world. You may think that's insane, but it's still a view that philosophers have considered. So metaphysics includes that. It doesn't mean that those theories are right. I tend not to go with those. But I do think possibilities are important. And they bear on questions like human free will, as to whether there are alternative possibilities to the ones that are actual. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to bounce off the
Yeah.
whole notion of real versus unreal in terms of what we ourselves believe to be real or unreal. Like, Darth Vader, like for us, it's a creation.
Yeah.
But some of that apply to things like heaven, that many people believe are fundamentally real, yet there's no kind of like physical evidence of it. So some of that apply in the realm of metaphysics, things like heaven, like
Right.
different things.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So when we don't know whether something's real or not, we can only really discuss it under the framework of some kind of possibility. Since, we can say, well, if it's real, then these consequences follow. Or we can say it may not be real, but even if it's not real, it's possible for it to be real. And so there must be some basis in our reality for that possibility, assuming it's possible. So you need criteria for possibility, and metaphysics looks at those two.
Yeah, I was just thinking now that this it seems this political theory that we're kind of developing, which we and what's not. So what we have right now, we have things we can perceive, versus things we can't.
Yeah, the best argument for the possibility of something is its actuality. So that's the knockdown argument that something is possible when we can say that it exists. And if we have very strong or conclusive evidence that something exists, then we know it's possible. But then there are other possibilities which we don't know to exist. We may not know one way or the other whether they exist or not, right? Like horse-like creatures that have a single horn in their head, or lizard-like creatures that breathe fire, right, and so on. These may exist on other worlds, or they may not. We don't detect them on Earth now.
They may exist in different forms that we just haven't really considered yet.
Yeah, and there may be all kinds of other qualities which we can't perceive, but other species can perceive.
Like, the monkey monkey too, if you look in the fossil record, we can see things that resemble what we perceive as myth now.
Yes,
Like the unicorn,
right.
there's like this giant rhino that lives
Yeah.
in Russia that has giant horns.
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah.
it's called the Siberian unicorn.
Yeah, right, of course. So these kinds of things certainly could exist. And by could, we mean the description of it is coherent. So the thing is possible, even if never actual. Yeah.
So I have another question about this definition. So kind of flipping the opposite way, instead of something that seems to not fit in it, it seems this is very broadly encompassing and hard to see how it doesn't encompass physics. I mean, the whole thing is this is beyond physics, but many
No, it's just
people
after
argue
physics.
that
It's just after the
is-
physics.
Yeah, but many people would say you could just erase the meta there, and it would
Yeah,
have
well-
a definition of physics.
Well, they can overlap. But metaphysics is more basic because it doesn't limit itself to just one kind of being. It's also open to other types of beings other than physical ones, like abstract beings, fictional beings, and so on and so forth. So it's broader. Certainly some of the categories dealt with in metaphysics are also dealt with in physics, like space and time and substance and so on. But they're dealt with in different ways. Just like the philosopher who studies the theory of knowledge looks at what knowledge is in the abstract. You can say every field deals with knowledge, but it deals with a specific kind of knowledge. Knowledge of biology, knowledge of math, knowledge of economics, knowledge of chemistry. The theory of knowledge deals with the concept of knowledge in general or in the abstract. Metaphysics deals with the concept of reality in the abstract, not any specific dimension of reality or slice of reality, but reality in general. So all types of reality would fall under its purview. All different kinds of beings would be studied in metaphysics, not just particles and their interaction. Yeah.
In epistemology,
Yeah.
what is the central argument, if there is one, that forbids metaphysics as being a part of science?
Well, as I said, science has, by its own definition, limits itself to the physical world.
Okay.
And metaphysics doesn't do that. Like I said, it could study supernatural beings, if there are any. And since supernatural beings seem possible, like you were saying, heaven is a possible, conceivable construction.
Well, some it is. And
Like, just watch The Good Place, on TV, you'll see. That's what's going on up there, right?
That's
So-
my metaphysics class.
Right? There's the good place and the bad place, and maybe that's how it is. It's possible. What's the contradiction in there being such things? There is no contradiction. So they appear possible. You won't know absolutely that they're possible till you get there and you see it's actual. Right? So we can have virtual or practical certainty of the possibility of something when we observe that it's actual, but we only have a limited degree of evidence in favor of something being possible based on its apparent logical consistency. But that's usually the test we have to use for most things that we haven't actually observed, like electrons also, which we can't actually observe them directly. So they're theoretical. It seems to be theoretical entities, which we believe their postulation to be well justified by their predictive power and systematic ability to systematize many of our experiences and allow us to produce cell phones based on the hypothesis that they exist. So that's pretty good evidence. But it's not certain. It might be that God just makes all this stuff work and there are no electrons, right? Which is what Berkeley said back in 50. I mean, God just coordinates all this. There are no electrons. It's just stuff you see. Right? The objects you see are real. But, not these impossibly tiny things that no one's ever seen. So, yeah. All right, so one of the things we do in metaphysics is try to come up with an inventory of what there is in the universe. And that part of metaphysics, which is a large part of it, and the part that happens to fascinate me the most, is known as ontology. It comes from the Greek onta, which is their word for being. So what would ontology be? Like the study of being or reality. So ontology, at its core, is a study of the basic categories of beings. The study of the fundamental categories of existence. I'll say, well, that fundamental categories of being.
Which categories actually exist? That'll answer my question directly.
Yeah, well, that's another really good question. So, categorization is a topic, a big topic. Even the more limited topic of metaphysical or ontological categorization is a big topic. There are different views about what categories should do. Aristotle thought they were really important. Aristotle is credited with having invented or established two branches of science. Anyone know what those are?
Biology and physics?
He's not really credited with physics. Biology is one of them, and the other is logic. Logic. Yeah. So he thought that categories were super important to both biology and to logic. They were really important in biology because to understand living organisms, you had to be able, he thought, you needed to be able to classify them as a first step. That seems to have been borne out, right? Because biology does a lot of classification, right? Classification of organisms. Can you really understand them correctly without understanding what categories or species they fall into? That's what Aristotle thought. What about logic? Well, Aristotle developed the first formal system of logic, which was known as syllogistic logic. It dealt with syllogisms, which are arguments that follow a certain form, like all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are going to be C's. That's just one example. But he had a whole bunch of different forms of syllogisms. And then he could demonstrate which ones were logically valid and which ones were not valid, and so on. Why would categories be important to these? Well, because the categories would be the terms that would be plugged in for these A's, B's, and C's, especially in pursuing scientific endeavors. Yeah. So categories were very important in metaphysics from the get-go. Aristotle wrote a work called Categories, which was actually his own, which was actually one of two works that initially survived into the Middle Ages. Everything else was unreadable because it was in Greek, and people in Western Europe totally forgot how to read Greek. So that whenever they saw a work of Aristotle, they would like look puzzled and said, "Right, that's Greek to me." Right? Later on, they were able to learn Greek from people in the Islamic world and in the Byzantine Empire. Yeah, so by the time you get to the late Middle Ages, they're able to read all of Aristotle's surviving works, which creates a big revolution in intellectual circles, leading to the creation of the first universities, which is why we're here now.
It wasn't the Islamic, it was in that geographic region, but it wasn't actually.
The Islamic philosophers were able to read all of Aristotle's surviving
Yeah,
works.
okay, but they didn't
The
get it
Europeans
from-
couldn't,
Yeah, but they got it from
because they could read Greek.
Westerners in their region. That's
Yeah,
where
yeah,
the
yeah.
Islamic culture got it, though, from at that
So
time.
the Europeans possessed manuscripts of Aristotle, but they couldn't read them.
I know, but I'm saying in the Middle East,
Then
it actually wasn't the Islamic cultures, strictly speaking. They got it from
Agreed.
in that same region.
They had Greek manuscripts, just like the
Yes,
Europeans did, and they
yes.
could read them because they had preserved the knowledge of Greek, which was lost in Western Europe. So
I'm
that's,
saying they weren't the ones that preserved it. They got it from others in the region
well,
who were.
they got it from people in the region. I don't know what
Well,
religions they
it
were.
was-
They could have been Christians or Jews or, I don't know. But these works were around. There were various manuscripts of them, but they were only readable by those who could read sophisticated Greek, and that was a very limited number of people. Eventually, Europeans got it through war and trade in the Holy Land, and the Crusades, and all kinds of means. It filtered over, which was a good thing, and sparked the advent of universities in Western Europe. So, all right, so if you're going to have a system of categories, it's really something that you want to classify your subject matter and to lead you to be able to have better knowledge of the items that you're classifying, to have a better understanding of their natures, and so on. In ontology, the categories may be of different sorts depending on your goals, I think. Just like in biology, there's not only one system of biological classification. There are multiple systems in use, depending on the purpose. And I think the same would be true in ontology. There's no reason to be locked into just one way of doing it, provided that the systems classify all of the objects that fall within the domain of study. So in a sense, the systems have to be functionally equivalent, even though, because they have to be adequate to the same data, so to speak. But they could do it in different ways, depending on what's useful. So one might adopt a system of categories where a constraint is that the entities in them have to be real, so like you were saying. Yeah. Another approach, a broader approach, would be that they have to be possibly real. And a third approach might be that they have to be possible as far as we can tell. Where you don't even have to commit to their possibility because you may not be sure whether they're possible or impossible, like angels. So you could have different constraints on them depending on what you're trying to do, I think. The simplest theory is going to be one that just reflects reality. That's very straightforward. It's also much more difficult to figure out. Because to come up with a system, you have to know exactly what exists in reality. And I submit that's a daunting task. It's a lot easier to say these are the possible beings, and even easier to say these are beings that might exist, as far as we know, which is the easiest to come up with, and would cover all possible beings and all real beings, and maybe also some impossible beings.
It's funny, I see you wrote privation as a category that you and Hoffman
Mm-hmm.
created, and it seems to be almost definitionally something that isn't there.
Right. Well, what we had in mind there were, I prefer to call them absences now, just because it's a little easier to understand. But it's either one. It's the same thing. The synonyms. Yeah. So an example of an absence would be a shadow, for example. So if you see a shadow of something on the wall moving around, one might suppose that one's observing something, a shadow, which has some form of reality. Or if you have a bagel, then there'll be a hole in the center. And you also seem to be observing something that seems to be real, though maybe not as substantial as the bread that surrounds the hole.
This is where you seem to be saying that there's
But I'm not.
there is something that
No, I'm not
isn't
saying that at all. What I'm saying is that it's a topic for inquiry or investigation to see if belief in shadows and holes and so forth is true or false. That's all I'm proposing now. And in fact, I think probably a comprehensive theory of reality may not need to include those things because we can understand them as functions of other more basic things. But that's an open question right now. We're just starting. We haven't looked at any of the data, and we haven't looked at what principles we might need to make decisions about what's real and what isn't real, which is the first topic I want to turn to. So, was there a question down on the
Oh,
side?
no, I mean,
Did you
I
have?
haven't taken something, but,
It's okay. No, I thought she.
oh, sheep selling.
Yeah.
Oh, there was just a fly that was
Oh.
going everywhere.
I killed it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, it said right there. It went too close to my head and I crapped it.
Right. So, yeah, so our vision of the world includes animate beings, right? Like flies and
That's why.
dead flies.
No longer animal. It's definitely a difference.
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Why does it matter for us to categorize absences? Like, in the greatest realm, like, holistically thinking about philosophy, what value does categorizing an absence hold?
Well, they might turn out to be important, like black holes or something like.
Okay, so
Turn
that
out
would
to
be
be-
more applicable.
I'm just taking that honestly.
Yeah.
Like, I was just thinking about that, like, so how we categorize, say, like, the void between stars, like
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
Like, how do we categorize space?
Well, space is different than absences,
Well, nothing.
though they're very intimately related, right?
Yeah,
But there can also be absences in time too, like a silence. So that's an absence over time. So if you say like the silence was deafening, right? So there's a huge noise, and then there was after that in time there was no noise, and then the noise resumed again. So that's a privation over time, and those always involve events. And then there are privations in space, which always involve like objects. So,
Your understanding of privation can also impact how you live your ordinary, like the actions and decisions you make. Because there's some views that like a privation of an action is what would be like a privation to fully realize like what it means to be human. It's one form of meta ethics. And so your understanding of whether a privation is a thing or not. It's very broad in terms of what that would mean to be. Okay.
the realization of an end, but there are ways in which understanding of privation can relate to like, even morality and other decisions, right or wrong.
The absence of one might make it wrong or correct.
So, okay, to briefly try to cover something like super, almost off topic, but very broad, long discussion, like a privation, so there's a position that something is good insofar that it adheres to the kind of thing it is. So, you know, if I go like that, like that's a crappy circle shape, but like the more rounded it is, the better circle. Obviously, it's not a moral circle, but you know, an eye that's, you know, focuses light well, be a good eye, not a morally good eye, but we're in one that fails to do so. There's a privation in that is a bad eye, and where it would get to morality would be in humans. If we have certain ends, like for example, as parents to take care of children or to live in communal ways, then the failure to do that, to fully realize that, would be a privation, would mean that the human is like a deliberate action of not fully realizing that would be what would be considered like wrong. Does that make sense? Just tried to get that as condensed as I possibly could. But that's how like an understanding of like privations could impact like how you understand whether you're doing something wrong or not.
Another question is whether you need privations to explain or talk about cause and effect. Like a hole can cause an accident, like a hole in the road. Mm-hmm. So the question is, do you need to admit privations to explain cause and effect in those cases, or can you explain it without them? So,
yeah, because couldn't you also say that it's not a hole in the road, but an indentation? Like,
well, that's just another word for the same thing.
Does it, like, for example, like language can affect the meaning of something. Like the words we can use different sentences to describe the same thing, right?
Yeah, but they could be just different ways of saying exactly the same thing, and so you haven't really explained anything that way. You've just used a synonym, like saying, there's a hole in the bagel, or right.
Okay.
There's
Yeah, I think you know what you're saying though. It's like
there might be a way of getting rid of them, right? But the point is that if you want a complete catalog of what exists in reality,
You have to talk about things that don't exist?
you have to talk about all the things that we initially think exist and exclude the ones that you think are dubious, right? I agree with you, there's something dubious about absences. Why? Because they're a form of being that's predicated on the idea that there isn't any, right? Which seems a curious idea, right? So they seem suspect, right? Yet we also talk about them, so we want to resolve that question. There's an apparent conflict. That's why we want to talk about them. There's an apparent conflict between our belief system that we start out with, which countenances shadows and holes and things. We could be scared by a shadow, so it seems to have causal power, and we perceive these things. So if they don't exist, that's interesting for that reason. But it's not the point of ontology to prove necessarily that privations exist. It's just as likely or more likely to turn out that they don't. But we want to know why, whether we need to presume them or we don't. Yeah.
It seems like if we're going to commit ourselves, or if one were to commit themselves to saying like there is such a thing as an absence, or saying like X is absent, then they would be claiming to have knowledge. Otherwise, that would make them expect a presence there. So like X would be missing, which makes me have some sort of preconceived knowledge that I should expect that X would be there. Like a hole in the ground, maybe that would make me commit myself to say that there should be ground where the hole is present. But I don't know if that necessarily qualifies for a presence of hole.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because mightn't there be certain naturally occurring holes and gaps and things?
Okay.
I mean, your thing applies more to artifacts,
What do you...
like Swiss cheese or something. It's made to have holes in it, and bagels are made to have holes. But there might be just certain natural phenomena where there are holes like in caves where limestone is worn away by dripping water and different things like that.
I was thinking of something more universal.
Or like black holes or whatever in outer space, or,
Like,
which seem to be like,
again, naturally occurring.
yeah, and also like extremely influential.
Right, right. But what about something, not a hole, but also something like, if on day one, we had that chair right there, and then the next day the chair was gone, we could also say something like there's an absence
Yes, of the chair there, yeah.
But we can also go as far as to say that there's an absence of cat in this room.
All
We
kinds
can
of
say
stuff.
All kinds of stuff. But it seems like the most accurate thing that we would commit ourselves is to logically say that there's an absence of chair because the chair once was here. But I don't think that I experienced that absence necessarily.
No, you don't.
Right,
No, the only ones you experience are the ones that are bounded by something,
right, okay.
by other things,
Oh, what do you mean?
like holes
Oh, like bagels.
and shadows, and
Okay.
you don't perceive these like absences of unicorns and elephants and
Right.
dragons. So those are much more dubious.
Okay, yeah, okay,
Put those to a side. I mean, those don't make the cut. But
okay.
when you have ones that are surrounded by
Yes.
being,
Okay. So like an
then they're perceivable, right? And once they're perceivable, they're sort of believable. Because remember, what's our criterion for, like, when we know for sure that something's real and not merely possible? When we
empirically verified.
when we see it there, right? That gives us our best hope of knowing what's possible. So you see a shadow, it looks real, you know. They can be scary, they can move, they can have colors, they can have all right. They can be black, they can be red. Like I was at the Natural Science Center and they had this machine that makes all kinds of colored shadows. Kind of weird. Yeah.
As well, come back to with the space thing, that it's not like space in general, but like how do we categorize the idea of nothingness between stars? Like space is
Something.
theoretically nothing.
Well, it's no, well, no,
in
it's
space.
well, Aristotle dealt with that argument. He said that space is not nothing, that it's something, it's space. So.
It's like, oh, like
So the idea is if you have a universe that has, if nothing exists, then not even space and time exist. There's just not any kind of entity. So that's what's meant philosophically in metaphysics by saying there's nothing. It doesn't say that there is empty space. No, nothing. No space, no time, no objects, no properties, nothing. And yeah, so that's what you'd be dealing with there. A vacuum is not nothing. It has dimensions, so on and so forth. So it has properties. They're just a lot thinner than ordinary things are. Otherwise, you get into these paradoxes that make no sense. You're saying nothing is something, and no. We're not going to get anywhere that way. It turns out to be incoherent if we think that way. We just have to suppose that by nothing, if we're going to be serious about it, we're denying everything, including time and space. Things which have properties, like a geometry, for example.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, Buzz's, Jimmy curious about that, like how will we categorize that? And you answered that. That definitely helps.
Yeah, well, Aristotle cleared up, because before Aristotle were these earlier philosophers who made all these arguments that nothing exists at all because everything's contradictory. One of the arguments was that, yeah, how can we say that space is both nothing and that it separates objects? Therefore, nothing exists except one thing, which was the argument that Parmenides made for that there's just one thing in the universe. Because there can't be space, because space is nothing. There's just like this one concentrated uber being thing, and that's it. Right. Yeah.
Emil Durkheim posits that,
Yeah, he's a sociologist.
yeah, they call him the father of sociology
Yeah, that would
because
be him.
he claimed it was a science merely due to the fact that if there's social evidence, not physical, but if there's social evidence, for example, the Bible is true, and you have enough people saying that that's a social fact, his claim was it's science because you can study it. So doesn't that...
But you can study the belief.
study the belief, but he said that social facts have reality just like seashells.
They do have reality, yeah.
So, to me, that puts science and metaphysics in a crosshairs.
Why are science and metaphysics?
Well, he's claiming sociology is an actual science.
Okay,